Opinions and Beliefs by Gustave, Book 4, The Conflicts of Various Forms of Logic. Chapter 1. The Conflict of Affective, Mystical, and Intellectual Elements. Section 1. The Conflicts of Different Logics in Daily Life. The factors influencing opinions and beliefs are interpreted through various forms of logic we have described. Because they are different, they often come into conflict. How is this conflict resolved? In fact, it only manifests itself exceptionally in daily life. A kind of balance is established between the opposing impulses of the various logics, and depending on the time, the environment, and the moment, our mentality allows itself to be dominated by one or the other. The balance we have just indicated is not a fusion, but a superposition of the various forms of logic, each retaining its independent action. This superposition of dissimilar logics within the same individual immediately provides the solution to a problem that is always perplexing. How can superior minds accustomed to rigorous scientific methods accept religious, political, spiritualist, occultist, etc. beliefs that, when confronted with rational logic freed from all extraneous elements, cannot withstand scrutiny? The answer is, in reality, quite simple. In their scientific conceptions, these minds are guided by rational logic. In their beliefs, they obey the laws of mystical logic or affective logic. A scholar moves from the realm of knowledge to that of belief, much like changing residencies. The error to which he often falls prey is attempting to apply the methods of intellectual logic to interpretations of mystical or emotional logic in order to scientifically ground his beliefs. The balance between the various forms of logic being disrupted, they enter into conflict. Rarely in this conflict does rational logic prevail. Moreover, it is quite easily manipulated to serve even the most childish notions. This is why, in matters of belief, religious, political, or moral, all dispute is futile. Rationally discussing an opinion of emotional or mystical origin with others only serves to reinforce it. Discussing it with oneself does not shake it anymore, except when it has reached a point of erosion that has stripped it of its power. The results of a struggle between mystical logic and rational logic could not be better illustrated by the example of Pascal, examined in detail in another chapter of this work. It would be unnecessary to dwell on it now. Therefore, in what follows, we will limit ourselves to studying the conflict between affective logic and rational logic. The struggle is less unequal than in the previous case, since intelligence can, through various artifices, not fight directly against feelings, but oppose feelings with feelings in an attempt to dominate those it wishes to combat. Section 2. Conflict of affective and intellectual elements. Action of ideas on feelings. The feelings that drive us have a great deal of influence on our ideas, while ideas have relatively little influence on them. An idea is generally only the culmination of a feeling whose development remains unconscious and consequently ignored. It is precisely because this life of feelings remains unknown that intelligence has such a weak influence on it. We need only observe ourselves to know the extent to which our emotional faculties evolve independently of our will. They exhibit a kind of slow germination, analogous to that so aptly described by the poet-philosopher Sully Proudhon in his famous sonnet, The Broken Vase. A word, a gesture, almost insignificant at the time, can in the long run transform friendship into indifference, sometimes even into antipathy. The role of intelligence in shaping the aggregate of feelings that constitute character is to isolate a few of them, intensify them through sustained mental representation, and thus enable them to dominate certain impulses. Through this predominance of the affective state over another, it can elevate the individual above themselves, at least momentarily. Thanks to its power to associate affective and intellectual mental representations, intelligence can therefore sometimes use feelings just as an architect, with the same stones, can build diverse buildings. This influence of intelligence on feelings is not unlimited, and even seems quite limited. Observation shows, in fact, that if the latter are very intense, intelligence loses all power. The strength of certain feelings can become so great that not only intelligence but also the individual's most obvious interests remain unaffected. We will give several examples of this in the chapter on beliefs. While feelings do not directly transform into ideas, they are nevertheless creators of ideas, which in turn evoke other feelings. Thus, while maintaining their independence, these two spheres of mental activity constantly influence each other. Ideas, therefore, exert, albeit indirectly, an undeniable influence on our individual and collective lives. But, I repeat, their role is only possible on the condition of relying on an effective substrate. Since ideas arise from feelings, the struggles between ideas are, in reality, nothing more than struggles between feelings. Peoples who appear to fight for ideas are, in reality, fighting for the feelings from which those ideas derive. Emotional states that lack an opportunity for expression lose not their existence, but their strength, like all organs left unused. Thus, the offices formerly held by the English and French nobility maintained character traits that vanished with the cessation of those offices. These social classes, having lost their moral qualities without acquiring the intelligence they had not had the opportunity to exercise, became inferior to the classes they had once dominated. It was therefore inevitable that the influence of the nobility, after being destroyed in France by the Revolution, would now be greatly weakened in England. This law, too, often ignored by our educators, that an unexercised feeling withers, seems to have general application. The history of nations provides many examples. Our warlike instincts, so developed during the Revolution and the Empire, have finally given way to a pacifism and anti-militarism that are becoming increasingly widespread, not only among the masses but also among the intellectuals. The result is this strange contrast. As nations become more peaceful, their governments constantly increase their armaments. The reason for this apparent anomaly is simple. Individuals obey their personal selfishness, while rulers are obliged to concern themselves with the collective interest. Better enlightened than the masses and their rhetoricians, they know from centuries of experience that any nation that weakens is soon invaded and plundered by its neighbors. Modern nations have no more escaped this law than their predecessors in ancient civilizations. Poles, Turks, Egyptians, Serbs, and others avoided destructive invasions only by allowing themselves to be stripped of all or part of their territories. The Chancellor of the German Empire expressed this truth very well in a speech delivered in March 1911 before the Reichstag, an extract which follows, quote, "The question of disarmament is, for any serious observer, insoluble, as long as men remain men and states remain states. Whatever the weak do, they will always be prey to the strong. The people who do not want to spend on their armaments fall to second place, and a stronger power takes its place." As the same statesman very aptly pointed out, quote, "The dispositions from which war can arise today have their roots in popular sentiments that are easily influenced," unquote. The evolution, or rather transposition, of feelings, some consequences of which we have just shown, occurs under various influences. The social environment is one of the most important. To adapt to it, the individual is forced to let certain affective states lie dormant and utilize others that are constantly strengthened through practice. This should be the role of a well-conceived education, that is to say, one concerned with developing the fundamental qualities of character, and in particular initiative, courage, and willpower, which other natural feelings can counterbalance. By opposing initiative, the fear of responsibility nullifies it. Hampered by individual selfishness, devotion to the collective interest soon vanishes, and so on. Section 3. The struggle of feelings against feelings. Inhibitory actions. All primitive peoples, savages, animals, etc., constantly tend to let their instincts take over. However, as soon as the former live in tribes and the latter are domesticated, necessity teaches them to restrain some of these instincts. They only succeed by opposing a very strong feeling, fear of punishment, hope of reward, for example, to another feeling whose impulses one would be tempted to follow. The ability to control emotional impulses is a fundamental element of civilization. No social life is possible without this essential basis of all morality. The inhibitory actions maintained by custom, morality, and codes represent not a struggle between feelings and reason, but, as I have shown, between diverse feelings that reason brings into contact. Civil or religious codes have always had the primary aim of exerting an inhibitory effect on the expression of certain feelings. Every civilization involves discomfort and constraint. By learning, under the rigorous law of early social obligations, to somewhat control his impulses, primitive man moved beyond pure animality and attained barbarism. Forced to restrain himself even further, he rose to the level of civilization. The latter can only be maintained as long as man's self-control persists. Such a constraint demands constant effort. It would be almost impossible if habits that education can instill did not eventually facilitate it by making it unconscious. If sufficiently developed, internal discipline can thus replace external discipline. But when one has failed to create the former, one must resign oneself over to enduring the latter. To reject both is to return to the ages of barbarism. Feelings will always guide us, but no society has ever been able to survive without its members learning to keep them within the limits below which anarchy and decadence begin. Feelings restrained by the social necessities codified by laws are not thereby destroyed. Freed from their constraints, primitive natural impulses always reappear. This explains the violence that accompanies revolutions. Civilized society has reverted to barbarism. Chapter 2. The conflict of various forms of logic in the lives of peoples. Section 1. Consequences of the destruction of actions that inhibit feelings in social life. The need to restrain feelings harmful to society by means of other feelings fixed by education, morality, and codes constitutes, as we have just said, the fundamental principle of collective life, and peoples never fail to recognize it. One cannot unleash feelings that society has painstakingly managed to contain without creating anarchy. Its first symptom is a rapid increase in crime, such as that observed in France today. This is further fueled by the growth of humanitarianism, which paralyzes law enforcement and, consequently, tends to destroy all checks and balances. Our current democracy is increasingly experiencing the consequences of suppressing these inhibitory actions which alone could counterbalance anti-social feelings. Hatred of superiority and envy, which have become its scourges and threaten its existence, stem from feelings too natural not to have always existed, but in the hierarchical societies of the past, their expression was difficult. Having now gained free rein, constantly encouraged by politicians eager for popularity and academics dissatisfied with their lot, these sentiments constantly exert their disastrous tyranny. It took a very large dissociation of inhibitory actions, more or less fixed by hereditary, for acts such as the revolt of postal workers, that of railway workers, and finally of several cities in a large department to have occurred. These social breakdowns only became possible through the repeated capitulations of rulers dominated by the weakness inevitably engendered by fear. Faced with the impotence of existing legal codes, the notion gradually emerged that using threats and direct action was a sure way to bend laws once considered inviolable. And if the rulers had resorted to so many cowardly concessions, it is through a profound ignorance of certain psychological concepts that no statesman should ignore, and that, in the past, they did not ignore. Of these concepts, one of the most fundamental is the following. A society survives thanks to the maintenance of this hereditary conviction that the laws on which the social organism is founded must be religiously respected. The law, the power that codes possess to ensure obedience, is primarily moral. No amount of material power could enforce a law that everyone violates. If a malevolent genius wished to destroy a society in a matter of days, he would need only to suggest to all its members that they refuse to obey the laws. The disaster would be far greater than an invasion followed by a conquest. A conqueror generally confines himself, in fact, to changing the names of those who hold power, but his interest lies in carefully preserving the social structures whose influence is always more effective than that of armies. Destroying the belief in the necessity of respecting social constraints represented by laws is to prepare a moral revolution infinitely more dangerous than a material one. Destroyed monuments are quickly rebuilt, but rebuilding the soul of a people often takes centuries. We have already experienced such mental breakdowns at various ages in our history, and in his book on Joan of Arc, Hanotor highlighted one in striking terms. Quote, "When all hierarchy is abolished, when command has itself dissipated its authority, when, through its mistakes, it has allowed respect to be lost, when the social organism litters the earth, the field is free for individual initiatives. They arise and, according to natural laws, seek their growth and flowering in the decay of destroyed institutions." Unquote. Sectarians who fight tradition in the name of progress and dream of destroying society to seize its riches, like Attila dreamed of sacking Rome, do not see that their life is a close web of ancestral acquisitions without which they would not live a single day. We know how such attempts will always end. We will undoubtedly have to endure them again. However, since only repeated experience teaches us, truths formulated in books are empty words. They only truly penetrate the soul of a people in the light of fires and the roar of cannons. Section 2. The mystical and effective elements in the lives of peoples. The role of rational logic, so preponderant in the evolution of science and sometimes the lives of individuals, is extremely weak in the existence of peoples. Undoubtedly, by examining only the surface of things without trying to uncover their hidden mechanisms, the narrative of events seems to refute the previous thesis. Historians perpetually incorporate reason into their explanations. If we consider only modern times, do we not hear it, repeated everywhere, that the revolution originated in the dissertations of philosophers, and that its main goal was the triumph of rational ideas? Indeed, at no other time has the reason been so frequently invoked. It was even deified, and a temple built in its honor. In reality, there is no period in which it played a lesser role. This will surely be discovered when, freed from the atavistic biases that blind us, it becomes possible to write a psychology of the French Revolution. Even in its early stages, the revolution was supported only by emotional factors. The bourgeois, who were its first instigators, were primarily driven by an intense feeling of jealousy towards a class they believed they had equaled. No doubt the people did not initially envy situations too far removed from their own for them to ever hope to attain. However, they welcomed the revolutionary movement with enthusiasm. This sentiment was quite natural, for the legal dismantling of social constraints and the promises dangled before them offered the prospect of becoming equals of their former masters and seizing their wealth. In the revolutionary motto, displayed on our coins and walls, a single term, equality, stirred minds as it still does today. Fraternity is hardly mentioned anymore, class struggle having become the motto of the new era. As for liberty, the masses never understood its meaning and always rejected it. If revolutions are so appealing to people, it is mainly because they liberate feelings that social necessities force us to restrain. but which are never restrained except painfully and incompletely. In a previous chapter, I demonstrated the fundamental role of inhibitory actions on feelings and their importance. They prove particularly necessary among peoples with strong and volatile impulses. If education, tradition, and social codes fail to channel these impulses and the actions that result from them, such a people will fall prey not only to leaders but also to any external enemies who know how to exploit their sensitivity. History provides evidence of this on every page. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870, for example, is full of lessons in this regard. The ailing emperor and the aging king of Prussia, who wanted to avoid conflict at all costs. In his desire to prevent it, the king of Prussia had finally renounced his relative's candidacy for the Spanish throne, and peace seemed assured. But behind these uncertain minds and weak wills, a powerful brain with an energetic will held the threads of destiny. By skillfully removing a few words from a telegram, he managed to inflame the sentimentality of an overly sensitive people to the point of fury, and force them, without military preparation, to declare war on enemies who had long been ready. Then, exploiting the feelings of each nation, he managed to maintain the neutrality necessary for his purposes. Blinded by the emotions this profound psychologist had stirred, England refused to join a proposed Congress, failing to foresee the cost to her later of forming a dominant military power, her nightmare today. Obeying emotional impulses condemns one to be dominated by those who know how to elicit them. To know the art of manipulating men's feelings is to become their master. Section 3. The balances and ruptures of the various forms of logic in the life of peoples. We have seen that, in the normal state, a kind of equilibrium is established in individuals between the various impulses arising from the logics that guide them. The same is generally true in the life of nations. When this balance is disrupted under certain influences, profound disturbances occur and a revolution is imminent. This revolution most often constitutes a genuine mental illness resulting from an imbalance between the impulses of various logics, one of which has become too dominant. It is primarily the predominance of mystical logic that produces the great upheavals of humanity. Crusades, religious wars, and the French Revolution provide examples. Such movements represent crises of this ever-powerful mysticism from which neither peoples nor individuals can escape. Most of history's fluctuations arise from the conflict between different forms of logic. When the mystical element predominates, religious struggles unfold with their imperious violence. When the emotional element prevails, depending on the degree of sentimentality involved, we see either large-scale military campaigns or, conversely, the flourishing of humanitarianism and pacifism, the ultimate consequences of which are no less deadly. Civil and religious wars are struggles between different logics, one of which momentarily becomes too dominant. When rational logic claims to intervene exclusively in the life of a people, the upheavals are no less profound. Reason becomes little more than a borrowed garment, concealing emotional and mystical impulses. Today, crowds and their leaders remain, as we have shown, as steeped in mysticism as their most distant ancestors. Words and formulas imbued with magical power have inherited the potency attributed to the deities worshipped by our forefathers. The delusional hope of enchanted paradises still lives on. While mysticism remains fundamentally unchanged, it frequently alters its appearance. Currently, it has taken on a rationalist form. It is in the name of pure reason that the proponents of these new faiths claim to build societies and individuals. The power of social transformation attributed to reason today is easily explained. Given the considerable progress it has made in the sciences, it became natural to assume that methods that had produced such results could transform societies and create universal happiness. A more enlightened psychology unfortunately shows that societies do not evolve with reasons, but under the influence of affective and mystical impulses over which reason has no hold. The difficult task facing the leaders of modern nations is to reconcile the impulses of various logics that actually drive them with those of rational logic, which aspires to govern them exclusively. Traditional England itself is beginning to experience this conflict. The political institutions that made it great are now under attack from the rationalist factions claiming to rebuild the edifice in the name of reason, that is, their own version of reason. The role of great statesmen is to know how to guide the destiny of peoples, using emotional and mystical impulses to drive them, and not trying to destroy these in the name of reason. The conflicts between different forms of logic do not always last, as we have seen. They tend towards equilibrium. Contradictions remain, but we eventually cease to perceive them. The intellectual element most often resigns itself to submitting to emotional and mystical influences, without, however, admitting defeat. This is precisely why we generally refrain from discussing our feelings and beliefs. Their analysis would, moreover, be quite difficult. We are not always caught in the lies of others, but very easily in our own. The ancient adage, know thyself, is unfortunately impossible to fulfill. For knowing ourselves, discovering the perpetual struggles that occupy our understanding, would plunge our existence into a chaos of uncertainty. Ignorance of oneself is sometimes better than self-knowledge. Let us remember from all the preceding considerations that mystical and emotional elements, having their special laws, always persist in the mind and serve as a basis for the conduct of individuals and peoples. Although often contrary, all our impulses eventually balance each other out and operate within their respective domains. If left undisturbed, and above all, if impossible reconciliations are not attempted between them, emotional truths, mystical truths, and rational truths are born of logics too different to ever merge. Chapter 3. The Balance of Reasons. Section 1. The mental balance, the action. The conflicting impulses of the various logics that guide us often make us hesitate about the course of action to take. Even the simplest cases involve a choice between several solutions. We must choose wisely, since the necessities of life compel us to act. How do we make a decision? An example will easily explain its mechanism. Let us place random objects on the pans of a balance. Once the operation is complete, the needle reflecting their movement bends to one side if the pans are unequally loaded, and remains vertical if they are equally loaded. Besides physical scales, there are mental scales whose mechanism is analogous. Weights are our motives for action. The pointer represents
the act that fixing the scale in its equilibrium position causes to be accomplished. These motives for actions can sometimes be reasons, but in addition to unconscious motives of an intellectual nature. There are most often unconscious motives already described, which weigh heavily on one of the scales. Ultimately, motives are forces in conflict. The strongest will prevail. When opposing energies are roughly of equal intensity, the scales oscillate for a long time before settling into a final position. This indicates uncertain, hesitant personalities. When the conflicting energies are very unequal, one of the scales immediately finds its equilibrium. This indicates decisive personalities that move quickly to resolution and action. Section 2. The role of will in the balance of motives. The weights of the mental balance are often at our disposal. That is, we can add or subtract them. The intrepid heroes who, for the first time, crossed the Alps and the English Channel by air, certainly eliminated from the scales the many rational motives capable of stopping them in the dangerous undertaking that no human being had attempted before them. Our will, however, does not always weigh the factors in the balance of motives. Elements of emotional or mystical life enter the equation of their own accord. This is what happens in certain impulsive acts, resulting from intense emotion, such as throwing oneself into the water in winter to rescue a stranger. Had reflection been at work, its influence would certainly have counterbalanced that of the emotional elements, and the scales would have tipped in the other direction. This is why, while great spontaneous acts of heroism are frequent, we observe much less, often small, everyday acts of heroism, such as depriving oneself of life's pleasures to care for a disabled relative. It is quite rightly that academies tasked with awarding prizes for virtue preferentially bestow upon them small, sustained acts of heroism. Conscious will can therefore influence the balance of motives, but this will is unconscious, as in beliefs. Its role is practically nil. Mystical logic then operates outside of us, if necessary despite us and against us. We are less defenseless when affective logic intervenes alone, because feelings are not too strong. Intelligence can dispose of some of the weights that represent motives. Our limited power to resist the impulses of emotional logic should not be greatly regretted. Undoubtedly, they often have disastrous consequences, but sometimes they also generate acts which are very useful to humanity. When man knows how to combine his emotional and mystical impulses with the discoveries that only rational logic can accomplish, he manages, as in the case of the valiant aviators mentioned above, to push back the limits of what is possible. In the balance of motives, where the genesis of opinions and beliefs and actions takes place, there are, as we can see, many forces independent of our will. If they were always independent, one could say, and several schools of philosophy still teach this, that a rigid fatalism governs us. Fatalism, in fact, dominated a long period of human history. Powerless to guide themselves, beings obeyed the fatal laws of logic's foreign to reason. Section 3. how rational logic can act on the balance of motives. With the slow emergence of rational logic, a new force arose in the world. It allowed man to act often on the scales once inaccessible to him, of the balance of motives. In a previous work, we studied the dissociation of fates, demonstrating how, guided by a strong will, rational logic becomes the primary factor in dissociation. Through its power, humankind can influence the course of events, ceasing to be dominated solely by the unconscious forces that once governed it. It learns daily to master them and control their dominion. And if rational logic, supported by will, cannot yet fix destiny, it is because most of the factors of events remain unknown to us, and many of our actions have consequences that can only be realized in a future that is always full of unforeseen events. This unforeseen event compels one to take risks, that is, to introduce into the balance motives and factors of unknown value. The true masters of the destiny of nations, the men of genius, of whom each century saw so few emerge, knew how to accumulate as many opportunities as possible on one side of the scale, and yet risk a great deal. Bismarck, whom we have cited several times because of his highly instructive psychology, clearly illustrates this necessity of risk. A guiding principle, the unity of his homeland, led him. But in his life, how many risks he ran, how many adverse fortunes, how many obstacles piled up, all of which his will had to withstand. First, it was necessary to destroy the military power of Austria, to which a prestigious past had conferred such strength. The victory at Sadova in 1866 was won with great difficulty, and only thanks to the extreme incompetence of the enemy general. Having achieved this hard-won triumph, it became necessary to risk fighting Napoleon III, whose armies were considered invincible, and perhaps would have been so had the likely alliance between France and Austria materialized. A great man could plan all these strategies but not guarantee their success. Only a bold character and a vast intellect illuminated by the superior intuitions of genius made it possible to confront such risks. Yet these risks had to be faced, since the countless factors that surround us and which together constitute what we call chance remain beyond our control. It is primarily emotional logic that encourages risk-taking. It is the primary support for an undertaking that rational logic must also guide. Great risks were involved in crossing the English Channel and the Alps by airplane, but rational logic underpinned a will inspired by the hope of glory, the pleasures of overcoming difficulties, and other elements of purely emotional origin. Icarus, who, according to legend, attempted a similar feat using only his willpower, perished as a result of his effort. One must be well prepared to defy nature and the gods. The master of visible and invisible history, eminent scholars, profound thinkers, illustrious captains owe their greatness to the fact that they knew how to use, without neglecting any of the various forms of logic that govern man, and to handle, thanks to them, the balance of motives in which the future is determined. Civilizations do not progress through the masses, blind playthings of their instincts, but through the small elite who know how to think for them and guide them. By trying to put intellectual logic at the service of collective logic to justify all its impulses, the terrible legion of politicians has only created profound anarchy. To summarize this chapter and those preceding it, we can say that historical events result from the balance and conflict of various logics, in the balance of motives that weigh our destinies, and all play their part. Should one of them come to predominate, the fate of humankind is altered. Too much emotional logic leads to blindly giving in to often disastrous impulses. Too much mystical logic breeds religious lives dominated by the selfish pursuit of salvation, devoid of social utility. Too much collective logic allows the inferior elements of a people to prevail and reduces them to barbarism. Too much rational logic leads to doubt and inaction.